Welcome to our first PowerPoint for the semester. We're going to go over what is history, what history actually is in this one. And so what we'll do here is sort of model what I want you to do over the course of the semester. We'll go through these one slide at a time, and I want you to take notes as we're going through it. Treat it like we're in a classroom setting as you're watching these. I am putting I'm putting all of these on YouTube so you can watch them on your phone or at your computer or whenever you have the time to do it. I just want you to do it during the week sometime. If you have any problems viewing the videos, somebody please send me an email. I won't know that you can't see it because I can see all of these unless you tell me. So we'll start with this what is history slide here. And what we're looking at is what is the historical profession, and something that we might want to start with is what history is not. And what history is not just facts, not just dates, not just numbers, and that might be what a lot of you have a preconceived notion that it is. And for a lot of people, that's what it was when you took history in high school or middle school or some other history class. It might have just been facts, dates, and numbers, but that's not what we're primarily concerned with here. We want to get to the story of history, but it should not be also, it's not just the story of rulers, kings, leaders, sort of these rich old white men. And that's what the profession used to be when history first became a profession in the late 19th century. It was the story of rulers and kings and leaders and wars and battles even. It is not that anymore. In the past 20 and 30 years, we have many different subfields in history. There's women's history, there's African American history, pretty much any kind of history you can think of is now part of the profession. So it's not just these great white men, if you will. It's not just the story of them anymore. It's also not just the story of wars and battles. There is a military profession discipline within history, but if you're, for example, going to become a historian sometime later in life, becoming a military historian is very rare because universities aren't hiring military historians anymore. The stories of wars and battles are being interwoven into the rest of the discipline. When we look at, for example, women's history, we'll look at women in wars and battles, if we're going to look at that. So how do we find history? There are three major categories of finding history, and they're all pretty self-explanatory. On the one hand, we have oral, and that's events and stories and information that is passed between individuals over time. There's a major field of history called oral history, where you just collect these individual stories from people. And this is mostly stuff that you would have to find in somebody's lifetime because it's an oral history. It also, though, is stories passed down over time. Think mostly of Native Americans or Aboriginals in North America or in Australia, and think of the oral traditions that you think about in those cultures. So that's the kind of oral history that we're talking about. Another major category of history is written history, and this has been the main focus of history for a long time. This is recorded or written testimony from living witnesses. And we'll talk about the difference between primary and secondary sources here in a second. When we're talking about written histories, when we're talking about testimony from living witnesses, we are talking mostly there about primary written sources. These are narrative records, previous histories, memoirs, letters, literature, legal and financial records. We got a whole host of examples here. These can also come from religious institutions or business institutions, and you can find these written records in archives around the country. One example of written records on our campus at Alamance Community College is the Scott Family Collection, and that's just right across the hall from the library if anybody's interested in going to see that. The third major category of history is physical history, and this we're thinking about archaeology and anthropology, those disciplines. Now physical, this is unwritten information that we get. This is physical remains from past civilizations, architecture, arts and crafts, burial grounds, cultivated land. These are the three major categories of history, and I'm going to ask you about these later on, so put a star next to this in your notes. As we move along, there are two concepts that you need to be aware of. Teleology is one of them, Teleology, teleology. This is the telling of history as a story or as a natural progression of events that could only have happened one way. This is something that we need to avoid because history can happen many ways. It just so happened that it happened one way, and probably the best example of this is Eurocentrism. Now, what Eurocentrism is, it's the act of viewing the world through a European perspective, if you will, with some kind of implied belief of the preeminence and superiority of European culture. This is something that we see day to day when we look in our textbooks or whatever history you're reading. This back to that great white men history I was talking about on the last 2 slides ago. This is what we were talking about. Great white men, we're talking about great white men, and those great white men were always Europeans. So Eurocentrism is something just to beware of, and I have an example in the next 2 slides, 2 examples of what we're talking about there. So here, this is our first example. Now this is a map of the world. This map happens to be upside down, as far as we can tell, but that doesn't mean it's wrong, right? These maps can be drawn in a number of ways, and they're still right. So this is just flipped around, placing places like Australia and South America and Africa sort of a little bit more prominently than they would be on a right side up map. So that's something, that's that Eurocentrism we were talking about. Putting Europe in the middle. In this case, we don't have Europe in the middle. So this doesn't make it wrong, it's just different. Another example here is when we're talking about certain areas. When we say the Middle East, and follow my mouse around here, it's going to highlight, we're generally thinking about this area here with a little bit of the Arabian Peninsula thrown in there. But if we look at, when we talk about the Middle East, we're talking mostly about Muslim countries, more or less. But if we look at the distribution of Islam around the world, and we don't get that into that in this class, take a 101 with me, a World Civ class, and we'll talk about that at great length. So the Middle East, does it just encompass this area, or does it spread all the way around where Islam has spread? So just keep these things in mind as we go along here. Another little example thing we have here is, what are these areas called? We just sort of make up names, and they're sort of geographically, they make sense, but not always. Oops. So just keep some of this in mind as we go along. The next slide that I'm going to show you here, we're going to talk a little bit more about primary and secondary sources. So a primary source, for the most part, it's something that a person saw, a person did, or a person made. And our example here on the right is the Declaration of Independence. That is a primary source because that is something that was written back then, right? These are the people who are doing it in the past. That makes it a primary source. The secondary source, just to put it basically, is people like us, people like you and me writing about it. And the example I have here is my first academic article, this one right here. So that's a secondary interpretation of things that went on in the Declaration of Independence. So as we go along here, the difference between primary and secondary sources is becoming important, and it took me an awful long time, longer than it should have taken a history major, to figure out the difference between these 2 sources. So it took me a long time to figure that out, and if you're having trouble with this, let me know, and I can explain it a little bit better via email or in the next week's lecture. But primary, think of that as somebody who was there, they did it, they saw it, they made it, they wrote it. And then the secondary source is stuff that we would write about, them writing about it. And on our next slide here, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what a hat question is, because that's going to become pretty important to what we're doing in this class. So I have this link here. It'll take us to some example hat questions, but we're going to use a lot of those as we go on through the semester. And so we have some definitions here. What are we doing with a hat question? And hat, just again, to go through it, it means historical assessment of thinking. It sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. And we're going to evaluate evidence, and that's critically assessing historical sources. And this is almost always primary sources. It includes the following items, and it'll be sourcing, which we'll be doing a lot of sourcing here because that's sort of on the lower level. And since I'm just introducing you to historical thinking in this class, sourcing will be our main focus, and I'm going to ask you to consider who wrote a document as well as the circumstances of that document's creation. Why did they author it? For what purpose? those are the, when especially, those are the kinds of questions we're going to be asking when we source. We might do a little contextualization, and that'll be to contextualize the document in time and place, when it was written, to understand why it was written in that fashion. And corroboration is getting a little bit up the ladder there, and that would be asking students to consider details across multiple sources to determine points of agreement and disagreements. That's something we might get into a little bit later in the semester when we're more comfortable with this. Historical knowledge, that's basically what you know about the past and how you know it. And it goes along pretty well with historical information. That would be the recognition and recall of just facts, important facts. And I should have made it a little bit more clear on slide 2 when we're talking about what history was. And it's not just facts and dates and numbers. It's a lot of that. It's not just completely facts and dates, but we still do need to keep in mind that facts and dates are important to historical thinking. Significance is another big one. Periodization, narrative, and historical argumentation. These are all, significance. It's pretty much what it sounds like. You have to evaluate the importance of a document for the people or events that it was written for. The periodization, that's what it sounds like. Put it into a period. When we talk about the 20th century, you break it up into the Depression era, the interwar years, the World War II era, the Cold War era. That's what we mean when we say periodization. Narrative, this is the story part of his story. That would be the narrative. And then historical argumentation, that's our interpretation of it. And I'll give you probably the easiest example that all of you probably have your own opinion of. Some of you probably stronger than others, it's possible. But the Second Amendment, how do people interpret the Second Amendment? This is part of historical argumentation. You read the Second Amendment to the Constitution, you see what contemporaries had to say about it, people like John Adams or George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, see what they had to say about it, and then you form your own interpretation of what that means. So that's what we mean when we say historical argumentation. And that's what we're going to do when we go through these hack questions, and I will do an example one with you next week, just so you have an idea of how to do it. And that's it for the first PowerPoint here. There will be another one this week that'll be probably right below this one. The link to that will be right below this one. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me at any time or send me a video message or however you want to get in contact with me. Okay?